And done. And thankfully you're here, because this week we have yet again another episode of Ray Donovan. And this week is Who Once Was Dead. Which, I didn't really know what the whole story was going to be about, seeing as how this was riding along the tails of the events that happened last season. I don't need to explain a lot. That's the details you're going to get. But with that said, let's continue onwards from last week's episode. So, remember how I said that the mysterious man winds up in Ray's room and then gets, well, you know, like that? Well, this week, as Ray wakes up from a dream seeing Mickey as a CEO talking to him, and then he's just changing spots between where he's standing over to where Mickey is sitting, and Mickey standing in front of him, and then it just coincides back and forth. He's standing in a stairway looking at the almost infinite stairway to heaven. It's crazy and nutso at the same time. But again, he wakes up and he sees, again, the man that basically beat him up and knocked him out, but also he tells him to basically get the hell out of the apartment, seeing as how this all happened, and Ray basically, last week violated the contract with Samantha and broke Norak. And this will be a troubling time for the both of them. But continuing onwards from where basically Bunchy was outside and he sees Sandy's car and winds up chasing after her like a dog chasing after a car. Well, Bunchy winds up catching up to her, basically crashing right through the back of her car. As from there, Daryl winds up tying in with Bunchy and Sandy, as, of course, Bunchy winds up going to their hotel room and getting the money back, but also this gives Bunchy an idea. We'll explain it later on. And essentially, with the side character, everyone knows what happened to Terry. Well, with Terry, he winds up returning to the bar, as we seen last week, for another chat about Abby, and next thing you know, the bar attendant and Terry wind up just getting it on, seeing as how they always think of fond memories of the past, But this also leaves this whole ordeal leaving Bunchy to get the money back, and tying into the story from last week and the week before that. So basically we're diving probably 2 weeks in the past here, as after the events of Girl Named Maria, where Teresa winded up taking Maria back with her. That's when we see Bunchy getting the money back and calling Teresa, planning on giving the $3 million to her. Will it happen? Who knows? But of course, seeing as how a lot of things are going on, Mickey winds up returning to Sandy's apartment, breaking into her home and digging through some old boxes and coming across something that was part of his past, I believe. Like he served in the Marine Corps, or maybe it was his father that served in the past. But from where I see this, where where he has the dog collar on and he's dressed up in the outfit, I think Mickey served in the army, or I see the USMC, so technically it's not the army at this point, so it's the Marine Corps. I don't study this stuff. I mean, I have a friend who's in the Navy. I think, yeah, the Navy. He's in the Navy, and all I know is just those four: the Air Force, the Marines, Navy, Army, all that. I need to study it more. Anywho, back to the Ray Donovan plot. Ray basically finds the money in Boston and slowly winds up seeing it in New York. As Ray winds up looking this information up and seeing on TV Novak telling the truth. But in the meantime, Mr. Agent, whom I keep constantly forgetting his name, so we'll just call him Mr. Agent. Well, actually, I think let's call him Informant. So, essentially, Mr. Informant winds up coming across him as he forces Ray to try and find, like, footage, some audio recordings of one of the mayors that is running for election from what we see of the previouslys, the recaps before the actual beginning of the episodes. From there, I don't think it really goes anywhere. It's just Mr. Informant comes in and says, "You mind giving me those recordings of him?" "Thank you." Just like that. So, I don't know, like, the next week recap, Ray basically brings up the events of having to give Mr. Informant the tape, so that'll be worthwhile and worth studying and seeing what happens next week. But focusing on another side of the Donovan family, Bridge winds up going into the campaign as she winds up finding out that she has been fired from her own job. And this really gets Bridget ticked off and winds up in the end going to a bar and sitting there contemplating what was life like. How can she break the bonds of herself getting away from her father? Next thing, we wind up finding out Ray winds up speaking with Samantha, which basically winds up having to reconsider his work with her and forcing to help her out, and tries to warn her that the mayor and the police are going to be after her, but she won't listen and lets Ray go. So the next thing we wind up seeing is Ray walking into an apartment to try and speak with Novak, but unfortunately somebody hung her in the shower. Oops. Insane on where the story's going, you know? But with this, as Ray's returning to grab his stuff and everything, Lena essentially questions his actions and sort of gives him the hard truth and just before she leaves, he basically tells him he'll die alone, with no one there to be by him. Shuts the door, sits there, and randomly in some portions of the episode, I noticed this, and especially it can be seen in the subtitles, but there are like moments where you wind up hearing a train sound effect, like literally like hearing a train going by on tracks. You can actually hear that in the audio. Like, I'm not making this stuff up. This is what actually happens in the episode. You hear train tracks overlaid in some portions of the episode. I don't know where they're going at with this, but could it be a symbol of sort of the train wreck that will be Ray's life? I don't know. I have no idea. But let's see where Mickey's at right now, along with Bunchy. Basically, Mickey's been awaiting for Bunchy and Daryl to return, as, Sandy winds up seeing Mickey in her living room, waiting to almost look like he's about to gun her down, but doesn't, as both Daryl and Mickey have a little chat between one another about family and all that, how basically Ray's a betrayer of the Donovan family, and how all this crap happens. It's really hard to even explain what this whole thing is about. But what happens afterwards is that while Bunchy's sitting in the car, unfortunately Ray comes in, steals the money out of his hands, and, of course, leaves him out of luck, as Ray winds up returning the money back to Samantha. But also we wind up getting introduced to the man that basically knocked Ray out last week, which the guy that knocked him out is named Vinny. Not making that up. But again, we only see him for like 2 scenes, and we're good to go. But afterwards, Ray gets a call to meet up with Bridget at a bar. He sits there, they have a nice little chat about how Ray's overprotective of her, and with Bridge telling Ray that he has to move on and not be overprotective, how Ray is just holding on to the past and making sure nobody, like his members are like not free or anything. It's kind of the reason why Connor left without any notice, or Ray or Connor refusing to let Ray see him go. Which, looking into that scene now, and this scene in this week's episode, I can actually see that. It's like I didn't catch it at first and thought it was like a big moment of denial. I won't go on that ramble anymore. I won't. So, afterwards, basically, Ray winds up seeing Bridge go, as he winds up deciding to follow her into the opened area of New York City, Central City, I think. Again, I've never visited New York, and I only know a few names of the location, so I don't know specific areas in some portions of New York. Keep that in mind. he winds up going into the central city and seeing Ray. It winds up basically tripping out. Like, one moment he winds up seeing Bridget, another moment he winds up seeing Abby there, another moment he's seeing Novak and Samantha. There's one moment where he winds up almost tripping out and seeing himself, but in a police officer's uniform. You tell me how that works. But it's then all of a sudden that Ray starts choking himself, or I mean the police officer that's basically trying to help him out, as he gets arrested and he winds up hallucinating himself at a therapist, probably in the previous season, where he's with the psychiatrist or whatever, and then next thing you know, he wakes up tied down to a bed. And he doesn't even know how he got there to begin with. Yeah. We've gone that far, people. Ray is now in a mental hospital. Which, while everyone's in a shock state and Terry's still going with his underground boxing at a new match and not even giving up for that matter, and Ray basically waking up and finding a man who's basically giving him some insulin meds, and everyone just in this sort of despairing mood and everything. Like, we see Bunchy in despair, Bridget in despair as she's packing up and, moving along with Smitty. Because we can never forget about Smitty. But, yeah, everyone looks in shock. Samantha doesn't even know how to react. We see Ray in bed, tied down, must I mind you. As the camera pans over and fades right on a patient across his room, shaking. And that is the end of the episode. For a moment at the end, I really thought that she was singing and everything. But I guess that's the song. I mean, it fooled me into thinking that it was this woman, like, shaking that was singing. You just didn't see her mouth move or anything. It's just weird. Anyways, that was Who Once Was Dead. Well, we're making progress, but this is a big, big shocker. I mean, more of a bigger twist than last week. Not only has he messed up everything for Samantha and Novak, and his hands being tied, having to force himself to work with the police and everything, but also with everything getting messed up, with Novak hanging herself, and basically Bridget telling him that he's gotta move on. It's insane, but it's bound to happen one day. Ray has to find that moment that he has to move on. He's holding on to the past for too damn long. Keeping Bridget and Connor tight in his hands and still thinking about Abby and everything. He has to move on. But in the end, how is it? Outside of the moments where Ray is basically tripping in the beginning and very near end of the episode, it's fascinating how all of this goes down. This is something. Hopefully we'll get answers next week and see what happens. Like, what will happen? Will Ray basically get the recordings that Mr. Informant winds up asking Ray for, and how will all of this situation turn out in the end? We won't find out until next week. We are slated for 12 episodes, just to confirm, which means we'll have episode 9 next week and episode 10. Which, yes, next week's episode falls under the week of Christmas. I'll do my greeting next week. But with that in mind, I'd say basically this episode is pretty much insane, but it's that special kind of insane that needs that special kind of attention that Who Once Was Dead needs. But with that in mind, I am the Ferb Guy, and I will see you guys next week for the new episode. So, see you then.